So if we looked at it on a map, the way we define Big Sur is actually an 80-mile stretch of coast, which is the San Lucia mountain range on the water. And this is a place of extremes. So we got almost 6,000 feet of elevation diving straight into the ocean. For us, it does boil down to these extremely diverse geographic locations, right? In the microclimates within all this diversity. The taste of Big Sur weed is, you can taste the woods. And a lot of our farmers swear by that. And I do too. That I can taste a redwood forest or an oak forest or Manzanita hillside. I can taste the difference in the cannabis. It was strains, practices, standards. Even all of those things were kind of at play in the regional. And even to this day, I feel like what they don't know makes us very powerful. Because here we are creating our craft, coming up with something amazing, and they go, oh my God, how did you do that? Well, that's for me to know and you to spend 20 years figuring out. Well, my name's Oliver Bates, president to the kind of de facto Big Sur Farmers Association, but we are the only local trade association and for Big Sur residents and for outdoor cultivation on the Central Coast. So we're actually the only group that represents that, and we're 60 legacy farms and multi-generational farms. Many of them are second and working on third generation farmers with a fourth generation on the way. So we actually we have this quite unique window into our history through these oral history accounts that we get. The holy origin is the stories of the origin of cannabis in Big Sur. The actual strong cultivation of cannabis happened in the early 70s, but had been cultivated in Big Sur perhaps as early as 1955 on a very small scale. And there's a few routes to these conclusions through the stories, and personal accounts ranging from 1955, a New Caledonian monk named Perry, who came from Mexico, maybe perhaps Mexico City, but there's a hermitage in Big Sur on the south coast where they walk around in robes with ropes, and they brew their beer and they got their incense and make fruit cakes. But there was this legend of a very special monk named Perry who had it in the vegetable gardens just as a healing herb, very medicinal thing actually. It was even rumored he may have used it for salves, not smoking, or for pain relief and things. Next in line would be the actual Big Sur holy strains, right? We know this group from the late 60s as the Brotherhood, is what they call it. And we know for a fact that there was a logging community and a fishing community that partaked in the beginnings of the hippie movement in the Summer of Love, even pre-Summer of Love. And many of them were known for the rural activities, but also their smuggling skills and what have you. And part of that story says that the pot growing in Big Sur started by the brickweed in Mexico getting more and more expensive. And people had tried to grow these seeds because everything was seeded. They tried to grow it in many regions. And for some reason, Big Sur just took off like Jurassic Park. So that's one origin story of perhaps where the weed growing in Big Sur came from. Definitely a closer origin to how it hit scale, or when it got big, or when there was actually production started. And then there's kind of a third one, which would be more around the early 70s and mid 70s, which is a little more just tied into the loose association of the community, and also like the founding and creation of the Esalen Institute and the international crowds and medicines and meditation and music and all these alternative lifestyles and medicines that were promoted through the Esalen Institute and its wide variety of people that were traveling folks. But two things are for sure. Most of it was most of it started in the late 60s, and particularly probably about circa 1970. And then the second being that for sure most of our strains, what they call the hippie trail, right? So in the 60s and in the 70s, many of the hippies went to Asia and went to places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, India. The hippie trail led these hippies to the best weed or the best hash that they had ever smoked, and they collected a few seeds, you know, and would put them in like the hem of their pants or in their shorts or in a bag of spices and just get a few seeds home and try it here. And that's where many of our strains, maybe roughly half of them in the beginning would have come from that hippie trail. You know, we've talked about the Brotherhood and how maybe they did a lot of Mexico, and then we have the hippie trail and how they were right there in the Himalayas, especially in the spiritual regions of northern India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal. You know, there's two other groups worth noting for sure: Vietnam and Vietnam era growers in Southeast Asia. Places like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, all those areas, which had their own form of exploits, but some rare strains as well, where it was often the same thing. It wasn't that they were importing because they knew it was the best. It was just like something they might have smoked there, and they wanted to bring a little something home, like as a memorabilia or something to cherish, and would bring these strains from that area. And then I'd like to think that there's even a fourth part that sort of correlates to the hippie trail, and definitely correlates to Esalen as far as opening up to world music, ethnic diversity, and different ethnic religions. There was a lot of folks that actually went to Africa. And we had a legend that would come to Esalen since the 60s. After the Woodstock show, all these hippies met in their drum circles, and a really famous African man that won a Nobel Peace Prize, his name's Babatunde Olatunji, came with some of his hippie brothers from Woodstock out to Big Sur, California, to the Brotherhood and to Esalen, where they started a long, strong tradition of ethnic percussion, and especially African percussion, which decades later I grew up in as well. And those guys were real hippies. So some of those folks would do the same thing, bring a little something special from across the seas. We actually attribute a lot of modern cannabis, the way we know it in California, to Patrick Cassidy and his brothers, the way they did it. Some of his legendary stories, as far as origin stories, where he was part of this group of folks that would import cannabis from Mexico during the 60s. And most of the weed that was in California outside of Thai sticks or Colombian gold or something came from Mexico, always, traditionally. And he was part of that mechanism. But through the course of this beginning to take Mexican strains that they were importing from Mexico already, the Holy Bud, from what I understand, we grew up calling the best weed in Big Sur Dolores, from a place right near San Miguel, Mexico, north of Mexico City in the Sierra Madre Mountains, I believe. And so that was the chronic. And these guys had like absolutely pinpointed the chronic crops of Mexico. That's what they were getting it. And so we actually knew it as Dolores. And the Dolores he had grown was amazing, and people really loved it. But where his origin story takes a wonderful and wild twist was there's a legendary story that they grew a bunch. They had never grown a bunch. They maybe grew, who knows, 1,000 pounds. They had a relation already with different smuggling groups. So the story goes that the Hells Angels came down and bought 1,000 pounds for the hippie movement, for the dead shows or whatever. And Patrick Cassidy said, "Oh, this will be the best weed that you smoked in your life." And they said, "Okay, whatever." They took it, and then many months later they came back, and this person from the Hells Angels said, "This was the best weed we smoked in our life, except for all of this." And he handed back the seeds and stems and said he wanted a refund. which they tried to honor because they were terrified of the Hells Angels back then. And then the story goes that they had heard about a technique in Afghanistan where they had taken the males out for hashish production. And they decided they would try this because one of their friends supposedly had rats eat all the males out of one of their crops. And they ended up with 6 plants of this amazing weed that had no seeds and got them so high they didn't know what to do. And so they tried that, and then the story goes that he said, take the stems out of it, take the leaves out of it. We can't do the seeds. We got to sell it like this. And then once that was done, those first crops literally blew people's minds. So many attribute Patrick Cassidy and his clan to really creating modern cannabis the way we know it, breeding up for THC, trimming, taking the males out, all of these things. So our forefathers learned along the way that if they can inbreed lines and turn them into a kind of a land race that might have a lot of diversity in its genetic profile, right? Like 10,000 different phenotypes. But they realized if they could get it to consistently grow with certain attributes and it was strong and it made it through everything, great. But if they could get 2 strains to do that over the course of time, when they combine the 2 in that same region from that region, then they get hybrid vigor. And that F1 generation is what we call our production strain, which many in the industry still have no idea. They're just dust and pollen. They're dust and clone, make another clone, dust that, make another clone, and all they have is genetic wild show that can never be repeated, right? And most folks are going through 10,000 seeds to find one cut, where a lot of our folks could start 10,000 seeds and maybe only have 3 variations instead of dozens of variations with no consistency. So that's why we call it a production strain, and we can put it into production and bank the crop on it and have a consistent bag of weed that doesn't look like Skittles. But all of us down the coast here, we were lucky to have these wonderful parents and forefathers that really showed us the complexities of breeding a strain into production. And not being able to bank our livelihood of a whole year's worth of work on hearsay or on a fashionable name or any of this other stuff. When I began, I learned everything from the elders, and actually only recently has there been sharing. And it was so dangerous and so tight-knit that it was very small. Generally, an old grower would only invite one, usually young kid, to labor like a mule. And maybe if they're lucky, share some of their knowledge with them. And I'd say that was pretty true even through the medical into maybe the early 2000s somewhere. So actually that tradition carried for a strong 30, 40 years, where if you were lucky enough to know a grower and then work very hard for that grower, maybe you were lucky enough to get a few tricks so you didn't have to spend the next 10 to 20 years falling on your face to get it right? Because it's a very finicky plant if you don't know what you're doing. It's very sensitive. It's hard. People think it says it grows like a weed. Not true. Well, the way I've seen it evolve is went from this very secret thing to this very public thing to this almost extinct thing. And at this point, we're fighting for the few survivors. So it may soon be like a thing of the past. We're often asking our politicians to give us a protected status like the condor. We're going extinct, you know? And when I reflect on it, I feel like it's only part of a more beautiful future. Where now with the appellations and cannabis, it's giving this powerful tool to wine and other forms of agriculture. And then we're not out of the woods yet, but I do see this beautiful, beautiful unveiling of the truth and exposure of best practices. and kind people. And at the end of the day, it's high quality, unique products that the market's going to want. So I'm actually quite hopeful that the markets of the world, and especially the ones interested in cannabis, or wine, or anything from here, crafts, cabinetry, chocolates, whatever, that once they really like unveil, I hope that we have, with the internet and other developments, I hope we have a much more educated, much more health conscious, much more safe consumer base. And there, I know we can shine. Once they realize where the products come from, how they were cultivated, you know, literally what they're eating, what they're drinking, what they're putting into their bodies, I see a better future. I see a bright and better future.